They say some days just feel different. Some days you wake with a weight you can't name, a sense that the usual rhythm of life is about to break. For one young woman, whose days had long been a relentless cycle of trays and smiles she didn't always feel, this morning held a peculiar stillness. It was the quiet before a storm, the low hum that precedes a seismic shift. She lived a life largely unseen. Her struggles dismissed as the cost of doing business in a world that often forgot the people who kept it running. But what if one seemingly ordinary shift could unravel everything she thought she knew, exposing the raw nerve of injustice she had tried so hard to ignore? What if today, the quiet underdog finally found her voice? Stay with us as we explore a journey of resilience against the odds. If this story touches your heart and makes you believe in the power of standing tall, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of courage and triumph. The stale scent of forgotten coffee grounds and yesterday's fry grease clung stubbornly to the air in the daily dish, a diner that felt less like a place of sustenance and more like a battlefield for the weary. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slanted through the smudged windows, illuminating the worn vinyl booths and the perpetually sticky tabletops. It was barely 6 a.m., but the clatter had already begun. Plates stacked high, cutlery scraped into bins, the hiss and pop of the grill coming alive. She moved through the narrow aisles with a practiced grace, born of sheer repetition, her uniform damp with residual humidity from the dish pit. Each step was measured, an economy of motion honed over years of carrying burdens far heavier than the stacks of pancakes on her arm. Her feet ached in her worn-out shoes, a dull, constant throb that was just part of the scenery now, like the chipped formica or the faded specials board. She was an essential cog in the machine, yet felt utterly disposable. Every day presented its own minor skirmishes, the impatient glare from a customer demanding coffee instantly, the condescending remark from a coworker who thought she was too slow, the manager's sigh when she dared to ask for a few minutes' break. These weren't grand, dramatic conflicts, but 1,000 tiny cuts that wore down the spirit. She saw the world from beneath, serving those who barely acknowledged her existence, living on tips that fluctuated wildly, a constant tightrope walk between making rent and going hungry. There was a quiet strength in her, a deep well of resilience, but also a palpable vulnerability. She was the underdog personified, navigating a system not built for her, where fairness often seemed a distant, unattainable luxury. But as she wiped down counter number 7, a strange stillness settled over her. The usual morning chaos felt muted, somehow different. A subtle ripple disturbed the surface of her ordinary day, a whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, today wouldn't be just another day after all. Intrigue stirred in the pit of her stomach, a mixture of apprehension and a flicker of something akin to hope. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of the first truly unexpected element of her shift. The air in the bustling diner thickened with the mingled scents of frying bacon, strong coffee, and stale cigarette smoke clinging to worn upholstery. It was the relentless tide of the dinner rush, a beast that roared to life precisely at 5 o'clock, sweeping away the brief calm that preceded it. Maria, her apron already dusted with flour from the pre-shift prep, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with dread. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the grill, the constant ringing of the service bell. It was a symphony of chaos that demanded every ounce of her focus. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the circulating fan, attempting to stir the heavy air. Tables filled in moments, a sea of hungry faces demanding attention. Each call of, "Maria, can I get a refill?" or "Excuse me, miss, where's our order?" felt like a tiny pinprick, accumulating rapidly. She moved through the narrow aisles with practiced speed, balancing trays laden with steaming food, her ankles aching from hours on her feet. The rough texture of the tray edge bit into her fingers, a constant reminder of the physical toll. A young man at table 3, buried in his phone, barely looked up as she approached. He gestured impatiently at his empty glass. She poured the iced tea, the condensation cool against her skin as she held the pitcher. A moment later, a woman at a nearby booth snapped her fingers.
Hey, are you even paying attention? I asked for extra napkins 10 minutes ago.
Maria's stomach tightened, but her smile remained fixed. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'll get those for you right away." She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not just from the kitchen, but from the unfair accusation. 10 minutes? It had been maybe 2. The demands escalated with the crowd. Orders got mixed up in the kitchen, drinks were spilled, and every minor delay seemed to magnify customer impatience. Maria helped a family with a crying baby, carefully wiping down the sticky high chair, offering a gentle word despite the frantic pace. She smoothed over a complaint about a slightly undercooked burger, assuring the customer she'd have it replaced immediately. This was the daily grind, requiring not just speed, but an almost superhuman level of patience and diplomacy. But tonight, a different kind of tension began to coil in the air, a specific gaze that felt heavier than the others, a voice that cut sharper. It was the kind of interaction that went beyond typical rush-hour stress, hinting at something personal, something designed to wound rather than simply demand service. The stage was being set, not just for a busy night, but for a confrontation that would test Maria's resilience in ways the dinner rush never could. She felt a knot forming in her chest, sensing the shift from manageable pressure to something more sinister looming on the horizon. The bell above the door jingled, a sound usually associated with cheerful arrivals, but this time it felt like a discordant chime. A gust of cold air swept in, bringing with it not just the chill of the evening, but an undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the small, warm restaurant. 4 figures stood silhouetted against the fading light outside, 2 men and 2 women. They paused, scanning the room, not with the hopeful gaze of diners seeking a pleasant evening, but with the critical, almost disdainful scrutiny of inspectors finding fault before they even began their task. Their clothes were expensive, tailored, and seemed to carry an air of entitlement, like an invisible shield. The lead man, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a smirk that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. Beside him, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper expression adjusted her designer scarf, her gaze sweeping over the other patrons with thinly veiled contempt. The other couple trailed slightly behind, mimicking the arrogant posture of their companions. Their laughter, when it finally broke the quiet hum of conversation, was loud and careless, cutting through the air like broken glass. Maria, polishing glasses behind the bar, felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. It wasn't just their volume, it was the way they held themselves, the way they seemed utterly oblivious, or perhaps deliberately dismissive, of the world around them. The usual friendly murmur in the room seemed to falter as other diners glanced their way, a collective sense of apprehension settling over the space. It was the unspoken understanding that this was not just another table. This was trouble walking in, wearing expensive shoes and radiating an aura of privileged indifference. They didn't wait to be seated. The tall man striding forward towards a table near the window, previously occupied but just cleared. One of the women pointed a long, manicured finger, speaking in a voice that carried effortlessly across the room. Though the words were indistinguishable, the tone unmistakably demanding. A young waiter, usually quick and confident, seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second before hurrying over, a nervous smile plastered on his face. The air grew thick with tension, the scent of roasting herbs and garlic suddenly mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of impending conflict. Everyone in the room could feel it. This table was a storm cloud gathering on a clear horizon, promising disruption and difficulty. The ease of the evening had evaporated the moment the bell above the door had rung. The air around table 7 seemed to thicken as she approached, a stark contrast to the easy murmur of conversation from the other diners. There were 4 of them, seated regally around the polished mahogany, their postures stiff, their gazes sharp. She felt an immediate, prickling sense of being observed, judged before a word was even spoken. This was the table everyone whispered about, the one that made the bravest server's smiles falter. Yet duty called. She offered a polite, practiced smile, menu pad in hand.
Good evening. Welcome to our restaurant. Have you had a chance to look over the menu? Or would you like me to go over any of our specials?
The words felt inadequate the moment they left her lips, swallowed by the palpable air of impatience emanating from the group. A woman with perfectly coiffed hair and eyes like chips of ice barely glanced up from rearranging her silverware. The man beside her, stout and florid-faced, cleared his throat loudly.
We've seen the menu, thank you. We know what we want. Hopefully you can manage to write it down correctly.
The words dripped with a sweetness that curdled instantly. A thinly veiled jab that landed like a small, sharp stone in her gut. It wasn't just the comment. It was the way she said it. A slow, deliberate articulation as if speaking to someone simple. The server felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her smile firm, a shield against the rising discomfort. She began with the woman. As she confirmed an appetizer, another man at the table, leaner with a perpetually downturned mouth, leaned forward.
Are you new here? You seem a bit hesitant. Do you understand the questions we're asking?
His tone wasn't curious. It was laced with open skepticism. He gestured impatiently towards the menu.
The duck confit. It's supposed to be crispy, not rubbery. You do know the difference, don't you?
The server's hand tightened on her pad. Of course, she knew the difference. She had been serving tables for years. She had learned the menu inside and out. But his question, phrased like a challenge, made her feel like an amateur, a child put in charge of something far beyond her capability. She maintained her composure, nodding slowly.
Yes, sir. Our kitchen prides itself on getting the skin perfectly rendered and crisp.
The first woman sighed dramatically, tapping her long, manicured finger on the table.
Just write it down. And try not to spill anything, darling. This silk is frightfully expensive.
The word darling was delivered with a chilling lack of affection, purely as a term of patronizing dismissal. It was the first truly clear instance of their condescension, a deliberate attempt to belittle her in front of everyone. The air grew heavy with the weight of their entitlement and her own rising indignation. The initial seeds of conflict, now firmly planted in the elegant but suddenly hostile space. She could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the way other diners seemed to fall silent or look away, sensing the tension that had descended upon table 7. This was more than just a difficult order. It was a calculated performance of superiority, designed to make her feel small. The tension in the small space had been simmering for minutes, a low, unpleasant hum beneath the forced politeness of the customer's demands. He had been difficult from the start, nitpicking, complaining about trivialities, his voice laced with an air of entitlement that grated on every nerve. She had tried to remain calm, offering solutions, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. The air felt thick and cloying, smelling faintly of stale coffee and the expensive, cloying cologne the man wore. He leaned closer then, his eyes narrowing, the fake smile vanishing entirely. The pretense was dropped, revealing the contempt that had been lurking just beneath the surface. His voice, previously loud and demanding, dropped to a low, venomous hiss meant only for her ears. It was a sound that scraped against her like sandpaper, chilling her instantly. The polite facade she had built around herself shattered like glass.
You know, it's people like you who make this world so inefficient, slow, unintelligent. Honestly, I expected better, even from someone of your type.
The words hit her like a physical blow. They weren't just rude. They were personal, cutting deep into a place she didn't even realize was exposed. Her breath caught in her throat, lungs suddenly refusing to draw air. The sounds of the outside world, the distant traffic, the hum of the fluorescent lights, faded into a dull roar. Her vision seemed to narrow, the man's sneering face becoming the only thing in focus, distorted and cruel. A cold dread washed over her, settling heavy in her stomach. It was the shock of recognizing pure, unadulterated malice directed squarely at her, for no reason she could fathom, beyond his own internal ugliness. The phrase, "your type," echoed in her mind, laden with unspoken judgment, a dismissive label intended to diminish her entire being. In that moment, standing before him, she felt incredibly small, exposed, and vulnerable. An intense wave of humiliation flushed her cheeks, a hot, stinging sensation beneath her skin. It was a feeling of being unfairly targeted, attacked for something she couldn't control or change. The sheer injustice of it was overwhelming. She was just trying to do her job, to be helpful, and this man had seen fit to strip away her dignity with a few calculated, cruel words. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of her perceived inferiority, delivered with a chilling lack of empathy. She felt the stark reality of being the underdog, standing alone against a tide of unfounded hostility, unsure how to possibly respond or defend herself against such a venomous assault. It was the sting that marked the true beginning of the conflict. A cold wave washed over her, starting somewhere deep in her gut and spreading rapidly, seizing her limbs in a sudden, involuntary tremor. The sound of the words, sharp and dismissive, still echoed in her ears, each syllable a cruel pinprick aimed directly at her heart. Her breath hitched, a painful knot forming instantly in her throat, making it difficult to inhale, let alone speak. She felt the hot rush of blood to her face, a humiliating flush she desperately tried to control, knowing any visible reaction would only fuel their contempt. The air in the room, moments before merely stale office air, now felt thick and suffocating, pressing down on her chest. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges, not from tears yet, but from the sheer force of the emotional blow. Every instinct screamed at her to recoil, to lash out, to defend herself against the blatant disrespect, the casual cruelty that chipped away at her dignity piece by painful piece. The urge to turn and flee, to find a dark corner where she could let the humiliation wash over her unchecked, was almost overwhelming. But she stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, fingernails biting into her palms. The pain was a small grounding anchor in the storm raging inside her head. "Swallow it," a small, desperate voice whispered. "Hold it in. Don't give them the satisfaction." This wasn't just about a single insult. It was about survival. It was about keeping the job she desperately needed, about not confirming every prejudiced assumption they seemed determined to make about her. This was the daily tightrope walk of being the underdog, where every misstep, every show of vulnerability could be weaponized. Pride warred violently with necessity. Her spirit cried out against the injustice, against the feeling of being small and powerless in the face of such arrogance. She wanted to scream that she deserved respect, that she was capable, that she wouldn't stand for being treated like she was less than. But the words remained trapped behind the lump in her throat, buried under layers of fear and the ingrained need to appease, to survive. She forced herself to unclench her hands, flexing her fingers subtly, trying to regain a sense of physical control. She focused on the mundane details around her, the cheap carpet under her feet, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant clatter of keyboards. Anything to anchor herself to reality and pull her away from the abyss of her raw emotion. The heat in her face slowly began to subside, leaving behind a dull ache. The trembling in her limbs lessened, replaced by a tense stillness. She willed her eyes to clear, her expression to remain neutral. A mask of professionalism, carefully constructed over the churning turmoil beneath. It was an agonizing act of self-denial, stuffing down the hurt, the anger, the burning sense of injustice, all while maintaining the outward appearance of composure. The battle was internal, unseen, but the cost was immense. She had swallowed her pride, held back the hot, threatening tears, but the bitter taste of the insult lingered, a poison seeping into her resolve. She had to keep going, though every fiber of her being yearned to break. The performance had to continue. His eyes, cold and assessing, scanned the perfectly presented plate. It wasn't enough that he had been disruptive. Now, he needed a reason, a tangible flaw to weaponize against the quiet dignity of the young woman who had simply tried to do her job. He leaned in, his face contorted into a mask of intense scrutiny, as if searching for a hidden defect, a microscopic imperfection. She watched, a knot tightening in her stomach, knowing this wasn't about the food anymore. The air in the restaurant seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation and dread. Then he found it, or rather, he invented it, a tiny, almost invisible speck near the edge of the plate. Perhaps a stray crumb, barely larger than a pinhead. His eyes widened in mock horror, a performance honed by years of casual cruelty. He pushed the plate back with an exaggerated flourish, the ceramics scraping loudly against the table, drawing unwanted attention from nearby diners. The gentle aroma of the carefully prepared dish suddenly felt suffocating, tainted by his manufactured outrage.
What is this? Do you call this service? Look at this.
His voice, previously a low growl, rose in volume, carrying across the hushed room. There's something on my plate. It's filthy, absolutely disgusting. The young woman, her hands trembling slightly, stepped forward. She saw the speck, minuscule and harmless, a stark contrast to the mountainous indignation he was building upon it. She wanted to point out its triviality, to ask him to be reasonable, but his gaze was sharp, daring her to challenge him.
Sir, I apologize. It seems there might be a small speck. I can immediately replace this for you.
She spoke softly, trying to diffuse the situation, offering the standard solution for any legitimate issue, no matter how minor. But a reasonable solution was the last thing he wanted. His goal was conflict, not resolution. He scoffed, the sound dripping with contempt.
Replace it, after I've seen the state of your kitchen, the lack of care. This isn't just a speck, young lady. This speaks to a fundamental problem with your establishment. Unacceptable. Utterly unacceptable.
He punctuated his words by gesturing wildly at the plate, making the insignificant speck seem like a biohazard. I've lost my appetite, completely ruined my meal. This entire dish is tainted. Thank you. His demands began to escalate, spiraling quickly beyond reason. It wasn't just about replacing the plate anymore. He demanded the entire bill be waived, compensation for his distress, and a formal apology from the manager, delivered with the humility he felt was owed to him. The color drained from her face. This wasn't just rudeness. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate, to extract concessions through intimidation based on a lie. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent audience captivated by the unfolding drama orchestrated by the customer's performative outrage. The air felt cold now, despite the warmth of the restaurant, chilling her to the bone as the conflict she had tried so hard to avoid crashed over her, built entirely on a grain of sand. The sudden shift in volume, the sharp edge in their voices had done it. Heads were turning now. Sarah felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not just from anger, but from the sudden, piercing awareness that they were no longer just a table having a loud disagreement. They were a spectacle. Across the room, a woman setting down her coffee cup paused, her eyes flicking quickly towards their table, before just as quickly darting away, feigning interest in the sugar packets. At the counter, a man in a business suit hesitated, a frown creasing his brow as he listened for a beat too long before turning back to his transaction. It was the quiet ones, the ones who looked away, that made the feeling of being exposed even worse. Their averted gazes spoke volumes. Discomfort, perhaps, but also a clear message. Not my problem. A low murmur rippled through a group of teenagers near the window, quickly stifled with giggles that felt strangely sharp, like tiny shards of glass. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, clutching the edge of the table. The air in the cafe, normally thick with the comforting scent of roasted beans and warm pastries, now felt thin, brittle, charged with silent judgment and uncomfortable curiosity.
Oh, look! She's getting teary-eyed? Having a little performance for our audience, are we?
Lisa's voice, dripping with mock sympathy, cut through the hushed room, ensuring everyone heard. Mark leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips, amplifying the sense of being cornered.
Yeah, better give them a good show. Maybe they'll feel sorry for you. Though I doubt it. Nobody likes a crybaby.
His words were loud enough to carry, laced with casual brutality. Sarah swallowed hard. The lack of intervention was a heavy weight, adding to the pressure. It wasn't just the bullies against her anymore. It felt like the weight of the room's collective inaction pressing down. Each averted glance, each quickly turned back, reinforced her isolation. She was the underdog, not just in this confrontation, but in the eyes of everyone watching. A lone figure, weathering a storm while the world went on, pretending not to see the rain. The silence from the other tables was deafening, amplifying the bullies' voices and her own growing sense of despair. She could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. This public humiliation, this feeling of being utterly alone while surrounded by people, intensified the drama, twisting the knife just a little deeper. The tension ratcheted tighter, leaving no room for escape. Only the stark reality of the escalating conflict laid bare for all to see. The air thickened, heavy with the unspoken tension that had been building. Suddenly, the customer's voice, already sharp, fractured into a roar that seemed to shake the very floor. His face, contorted with rage, was inches from hers now, spittle flying with each vicious word. She recoiled slightly, the sour smell of his breath a foul addition to the oppressive atmosphere. This was it. The argument wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It had erupted into a full-blown public spectacle.
Are you even listening, you incompetent idiot? I asked you a simple question. Or is that too much for someone like you to handle?
His words weren't just loud. They were laced with a venom that chilled her to the bone. A personal attack disguised as frustration. A knot of icy fear twisted in her stomach, but beneath it, a hot wave of indignation began to rise. People nearby had stopped pretending not to listen, their gazes fixed on the scene, a silent audience to her humiliation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to intensify the harsh reality of the moment, making her feel exposed and vulnerable under their cold glare. She tried to maintain a semblance of professionalism, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts.
Sir, there's no need for that kind of language. I'm trying to assist you, but you need to calm down.
His laugh was a harsh, barking sound, devoid of humor.
Calm down. I need to calm down? You've wasted my time, you've messed everything up, and you expect me to be calm? Look at you. You probably couldn't handle a real job if you tried. This is clearly beyond your limited capabilities.
The personal insults stung, each word a deliberate jab aimed at her competence, her very worth. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms, a small, private pain against the onslaught of the public one. She could feel the heat flooding her face, a mixture of shame and growing anger. This wasn't about the service anymore. It was about him tearing her down. The sound of his aggression filled the space, echoing off the walls, trapping her in this nightmare. It felt like being physically assaulted by noise and cruelty. Every nerve ending screamed for escape, but she was rooted to the spot, cornered by his escalating fury and the eyes of the onlookers. This was the peak of the storm, and she was standing right in its eye, bracing against the relentless, bitter wind of his contempt. The pressure in her chest tightened, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. It seemed there was no limit to his aggression, nowhere left for the conflict to go but to a breaking point. The air in the cramped office felt thick and suffocating, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Each calculated slight, each whispered lie, each outright act of sabotage had chipped away at her resolve, brick by painstaking brick, until the wall she had built around her emotions was crumbling. The pressure was relentless, a constant, gnawing anxiety that had become her unwelcome companion. It settled deep in her chest, a tight, burning knot that made each breath feel like a struggle. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the screen, the latest blow delivered with cold precision. They had blocked access to the critical data she needed, effectively stopping her progress dead in its tracks, while simultaneously spreading rumors of her incompetence. A dry, acrid taste coated her tongue, the bitter tang of utter defeat mingled with rising panic. She could hear their voices from the hallway, muffled but distinct, the sound of their cruel laughter, a sharp, grating noise that scraped against her raw nerves. It was the sound of hyenas closing in, savoring the kill. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, trying to hold back the stinging moisture gathering there, threatening to spill over and betray the extent of her pain. This wasn't just frustration anymore. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, the kind that seeped into your very soul. This was the nadir, the absolute lowest point she had reached in this relentless, unfair battle. She felt exposed, vulnerable, the underdog pinned down, battered, and losing the will to fight back. Every instinct screamed at her to curl up, to disappear, to surrender to the overwhelming tide of injustice. It was too much. The unfairness of it all, the sheer malice directed her way for simply trying to do her job and succeed, felt like a physical assault. Her vision blurred, not just from the unshed tears, but from the sheer weight of despair clouding her mind. Then a shadow fell over her desk. She looked up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, to see one of the instigators standing there, a smug, superior look plastered across his face.
Having trouble, little one? Maybe this isn't the place for someone who can't handle the pressure.
His voice dripped with condescension, a final cruel twist of the knife. Next to him, his accomplice offered a simpering, fake-sweet smile that was colder than ice.
Oh, bless her heart. She looks like she's about to cry. Did the big bad project break you?
Their words were like tiny daggers, finding the weakest spots, piercing the last vestiges of her control. A sob caught in her throat, a small, pathetic sound she instantly regretted making. It was the sound of her breaking point, the moment the dam finally cracked under the unbearable strain. The world tilted slightly, the edges of her vision darkening as the full force of her helplessness washed over her. This was it. She was on the verge of a complete breakdown, trapped in a nightmare with no apparent escape. Yet, amidst the escalating cruelty, a pair of eyes had been watching. Not the casual glance of a passerby or the hurried look of someone trying to avoid trouble, but a steady, thoughtful gaze from across the room. The observer sat quietly, almost invisible in a dimly lit corner booth, a half-finished cup of untouched coffee growing cold before them. They were a figure of quiet strength, clad in simple, well-worn clothing that spoke of practicality rather than pretense. Their face, etched with lines that hinted at both hardship and wisdom, was impassive for the longest time, revealing nothing of the thoughts swirling within. They had witnessed the subtle jabs, the thinly veiled threats, the way smiles twisted into sneers when the target of their malice turned away. They saw the forced composure crack, the desperate attempts to maintain dignity crumbling under the relentless assault. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment, a bitter taste in the back of the observer's throat. Every harsh word, every dismissive gesture, every calculated look of disdain felt like a stone being thrown, one by one, chipping away at a spirit already fragile. The observer heard the low murmur of the bullies, the sharp edges of their laughter, the way the victim's voice trembled when they tried to defend themselves. A knot tightened in the observer's chest with each cruel exchange. Then came the moment that tipped the scales. A particularly vicious remark, laced with pure venom, struck with the force of a physical blow, leaving the victim utterly breathless, their eyes welling with unshed tears. It was a low point, a moment where the injustice was so raw, so undeniable, that it resonated even with those who had tried to remain detached. It was the sound of hope being crushed, a quiet whimper swallowed by the indifference of the surroundings. The observer's impassivity finally broke. A flicker of something powerful ignited in their eyes, not anger, but a profound, weary determination. Their hand, which had been resting calmly on the table, clenched into a fist. It was time. They had seen enough. With a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cut through the tension in the room, they pushed back their chair. The scrape against the floor, a surprisingly loud sound in the strained silence. All heads turned. The bullies froze, their smug expressions faltering. The victim looked up, startled, a flicker of confusion amidst their despair. The strangers stood, unfolding their tall frame, their gaze sweeping across the scene. Calm but piercing, they took a single step forward, then another, moving out of the shadows and into the light, their presence suddenly commanding the attention of everyone present. The quiet observer was quiet no longer. They had stepped onto the stage, and the story was about to change in ways no one could have anticipated. A hush fell over the room, heavy with anticipation and unease. The air in the small cafe had grown thick with an uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the sharp, disdainful words of the rude customer and the quiet, strained breathing of the young woman behind the counter. Every eye in the room had been glued to the ugly spectacle unfolding, a mix of shock, pity, and helplessness, freezing the scattered patrons in their seats. The victim, shoulders hunched, head slightly bowed, seemed to shrink further with each cruel remark, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the register. Her uniform, usually crisp, looked crumpled with stress, and the faint scent of brewing coffee and stale pastries hung heavy, unnoticed amidst the human tension. Then, a subtle shift occurred near the window table. A figure, previously just another face in the crowd, a man who had been quietly observing, pushed back his chair with a soft scrape that nonetheless cut through the strained quiet. He stood, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He wasn't imposing in size, but something in his posture, a quiet confidence, drew the eye. The rude customer, mid-sentence in another tirade about poor service and misplaced loyalty cards, paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face at the interruption. The stranger didn't raise his voice, didn't rush forward. He simply walked a few steps towards the counter, stopping beside an empty table between the rude customer and the young cashier. He looked first at the flustered employee, a moment of calm, steady gaze passing between them. Then he turned his attention to the rude customer, who was now staring at him, her mouth slightly agape, curiosity overriding her indignation for a split second. And then he spoke, not to reprimand, not to defend, but something entirely unexpected. His voice was low, resonant, carrying just enough to be heard by everyone in the sudden, tense stillness.
"Excuse me,"
he began, and the woman visibly bristled, preparing for a confrontation.
"I couldn't help but notice the beautiful artwork on your bag."
The cafe fell utterly silent. The rude customer's face, contorted moments before in anger, froze in pure, unadulterated shock. The young woman behind the counter, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears, slowly lifted her head, staring at the stranger as if he had just spoken in an alien language. The handful of patrons scattered around the room exchanged bewildered glances. Of all the possible responses, of all the ways to interject, this mundane, almost absurd observation about a handbag was the last anyone had anticipated. It was a left turn so sharp, so completely out of sync with the escalating conflict, that it snatched the air right out of the room, replacing it with a collective, stunned bewilderment. The dynamics had shifted in an instant. The focus yanked violently away from the confrontation and onto the quiet man who had just uttered the most unexpected words. Anya's world felt impossibly small, a cage built of cruel words and suffocating pressure. She sat across the polished table, the air thick with the familiar scent of stale coffee and corporate dread, the faces of her tormentors smugly set against her. This was it, she thought, the final humiliation, the moment they stripped away the last of her dignity. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. The rough texture of her worn skirt, a small, grounding reality against the polished, hostile environment. A cold dread settled in her stomach, heavy as stone. Then the door opened again. It wasn't the manager returning with the predetermined outcome they all expected. It was him, the stranger from the lobby, the man with eyes that held an unnerving calmness, the one who had offered that fleeting, bewildering smile days ago. He stepped into the room, and the temperature seemed to shift. He wasn't invited. He simply was there. The bullies exchanged confused, then irritated glances. Mr. Sterling, the name Anya had overheard whispered once, didn't sit. He simply stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding. The scent of expensive fabric and something clean and metallic, perhaps the subtle aroma of confidence, seemed to fill the space, pushing back the staleness. He looked directly at the manager. Then his gaze swept over the others before settling, briefly, on Anya. Silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. The lead bully, Mark, finally broke it, a note of arrogance still in his voice.
Excuse me, sir. This is a private meeting. You need to leave.
Mr. Sterling didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, yet every word resonated with an authority that instantly silenced the room, stripping the bullies of their practiced bluster.
On the contrary,
He stated, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable weight.
this is now very much my meeting.
He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, observing their bewildered reactions.
You see,
He continued, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression as he looked directly at Anya.
I observed the culture here. I saw the potential being crushed by pettiness and malice. And I saw a certain injustice that demanded immediate, decisive action.
He picked up a folder that lay innocuously on a side table, opened it, but didn't look at it. His eyes remained on the faces around the table.
Effective immediately.
He announced, the words dropping like stones into a pond, the ripples shattering their reality.
I have acquired a controlling interest in this company. This organization is now under new ownership, and I am its new CEO.
Anya gasped, a small choked sound that was lost in the sudden, collective intake of breath from the others. The bullies' faces drained of color, their eyes wide with shock and burgeoning terror. This wasn't just a stranger. This was the stranger who had, in one incomprehensible act of immense scale and startling precision, dismantled their entire power structure. He hadn't just offered a kind word. He had bought the battlefield. His gaze found Anya's again, and this time, the calm in his eyes was a promise. The twist wasn't just his intervention. It was the sheer, unexpected magnitude of it. It was the dawn of a new, terrifying era for those who had thrived on her misery, and the first glorious crack of light for Anya. This wasn't just kindness. It was strategic, overwhelming salvation. The payback had begun with the simple, devastating signature on a set of acquisition papers. The air around their table, moments before filled with sharp, dismissive laughter, became thick with stunned silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, sucking the sound from the busy restaurant. Forks paused mid-air, drinks were forgotten, and smiles froze on faces contorted in disbelief. The rude customer, the one who had reveled in the discomfort of others, felt a sudden, intense heat rush up his neck and flood his face. His eyes, moments before narrowed in contempt, were now wide and darting, unable to meet the steady, calm gaze of the stranger who had just so quietly, so simply, undone his performance. His wife, equally smug moments earlier, looked as though she'd swallowed something bitter and sour, her lips pursed tightly, a flush rising on her cheeks, matching her husband's. The stranger's words, delivered without malice or fanfare, hung in the sudden stillness, a stark contrast to the blustering rudeness they had witnessed. The scent of garlic and herbs from untouched pasta suddenly seemed overwhelming, cloying in the heavy atmosphere. Every eye in the vicinity seemed to be drawn to their table, not with the amusement they'd courted earlier, but with a silent, uncomfortable scrutiny. They felt naked, exposed not by shouting or confrontation, but by an act of unexpected grace. The carefully constructed wall of arrogance they had built around themselves crumbled in an instant, leaving them vulnerable and foolish. The rude customer's mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet. He wanted to say something sharp, something cutting, to regain control, but the words wouldn't form. All that came out was a strained, choked sound, like air escaping a punctured balloon.
I didn't.
He sputtered, his voice weak and uncertain, a pathetic echo of his former bluster.
That's you can't just.
He trailed off, completely lost, meeting the unwavering gaze of the man who had offered kindness instead of anger, understanding instead of judgment. The sheer, unexpected generosity of it had caught him completely off guard, leaving him defenseless. His wife fared no better, staring blankly at the table, her earlier pretense of sophistication evaporating into sheer, mortified silence. This wasn't the reaction they had anticipated. This wasn't a fight they knew how to win. They were trapped by their own meanness, highlighted by the luminous contrast of the stranger's simple decency. This was the moment the tables truly turned, the ironic consequence of their cruelty laid bare for all to see. And the silent, burning shame was just the beginning. The weight, so heavy it had bowed her shoulders and constricted her breath for weeks, suddenly lifted. It wasn't just gone. It was as if it had never existed, replaced by an incredible lightness, a sensation so foreign and startling it almost felt like floating. Her knees, previously stiff with dread, seemed to buckle slightly, not from weakness, but from the sudden, overwhelming absence of strain. A ragged gasp escaped her lips, an involuntary sound that carried the echo of a silent scream held captive for far too long. It was relief, pure and undiluted, rushing through her veins like a warm, powerful current. Tears, hot and unexpected, sprang to her eyes, blurring the world around her into soft, indistinct shapes. These weren't the tears of despair or frustration she had grown so accustomed to. These were different. Tears of release, of a tension finally snapping after being stretched taut beyond endurance. The air felt suddenly thicker, sweeter, easier to inhale. She could smell the faint scent of rain on warm pavement, a detail she hadn't even noticed moments before. Her senses dulled by anxiety. Her gaze was fixed on the stranger who had performed this unexpected, miraculous act. The sheer generosity, the lack of hesitation, the quiet dignity with which it had been done, it was almost too much to comprehend. Gratitude surged within her, a wave so profound it stole her voice. How could she ever thank someone who had stepped into her darkest moment and illuminated it with such light? It wasn't just the physical act, it was the message it carried. Someone saw her, someone believed her, someone cared enough to intervene when she felt utterly alone, abandoned, and cornered. For weeks, she had felt invisible, her struggles dismissed, her pleas ignored. The bullies had treated her like a non-entity. The system had seemed indifferent, and her hope had dwindled to a flicker. But in this single, unexpected moment, that flicker roared back to life. She was seen. She mattered. This was more than just help. It was validation. It was a lifeline thrown just as she felt herself sinking. A shaky sob escaped her, followed by another. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart. A stark contrast to the numb despair that had settled there. This wasn't just about the immediate problem being solved. It was about the profound human connection, the reminder that kindness still existed, that strangers could offer solace and support when those who should have helped turned away. It was a positive emotional trigger so powerful, it was reshaping her entire perspective. The fear didn't vanish instantly, but it receded, replaced by a burgeoning sense of possibility. This feeling, this overwhelming flood of relief and gratitude, was the first real step in her rise. The underdog was no longer entirely alone. Someone had just tipped the scales, offering not just aid, but the precious, empowering feeling of being seen and supported. A cold dread clung to the rude customer's face, replacing the arrogant smirk that had been fixed there moments before. The others in his group mirrored his sudden paleness, their earlier bluster deflating like burst balloons. There was no defiant parting shot, no attempt to save face. Instead, a desperate urgency seized them. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished floor as they fumbled for coats and bags. The clatter seemed deafening in the sudden, stunned silence of the restaurant. He stood first, casting a quick, shifty glance around, not meeting anyone's eye. His companions followed, heads bowed, movements jerky and uncoordinated. They looked less like a cohesive, entitled unit and more like rats scattering from a suddenly illuminated room. One woman tripped slightly near the table, catching herself awkwardly on the chair back, a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. The man mumbled something low and harsh under his breath, propelling his group towards the exit. The heavy glass door swung open and then shut with a soft thud, sealing the void where their boisterous, cruel presence had been. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from the room. A tangible wave of relief washed over the remaining diners. The air, which had felt thick with tension and hostility, suddenly seemed breathable again. The lingering scent of expensive perfume and the faint, acrid smell of their arrogance faded quickly, replaced by the comforting aromas of food and coffee. Throughout the restaurant, heads began to turn, not with fear or annoyance this time, but with quiet curiosity and a shared sense of disbelief. Whispers rippled through the tables, eyes, previously downcast or trying to ignore the scene, now met across the room, sharing silent messages of awe and vindication. A few staff members, who had hovered anxiously, now exchanged small, relieved smiles. The quiet dignity of justice served settled over the space, a profound shift in the restaurant's soul. The departure wasn't just a physical exit, it was the definitive end of their reign of rudeness, clearing the stage for a different kind of power, the quiet strength of those who had endured and finally overcome. The space they left behind felt lighter, freer, a stark contrast to the oppressive weight they had carried. It was a victory measured not in cheers, but in the palpable peace that descended upon the room. The heavy weight that had pressed down on her for so long, a suffocating blanket of despair woven from betrayal and injustice, began to lift, piece by agonizing piece. Looking back at the tumultuous path she had walked, from the gut-wrenching shock of the initial attack on her spirit and livelihood, to the relentless onslaught that followed, it felt less like a journey and more like surviving a storm. Each blow, each cruel word, each moment of isolation had chipped away at her, threatening to extinguish the light within. She had been the underdog, cornered and vulnerable, facing forces that seemed insurmountable, powered by malice and indifference. The conflict had escalated with terrifying speed, tearing at the very fabric of her reality. But something fundamental had shifted within her. The struggle had forged an unyielding resilience, a quiet strength she never knew she possessed. It was the kind of strength that came not from overpowering others, but from simply refusing to be broken. The moral clarity gained was sharp and absolute, like the first clear dawn after days of fog. She saw the stark lines between right and wrong, not as abstract concepts, but etched in the very real pain she had endured and the unexpected kindness she had received. There was a profound understanding now of how easily cruelty could flourish when unchecked, and how desperately courage and compassion were needed to counter it. The sheer brutality of the bullying had revealed the worst of human nature, a chilling reflection that could make one question the very fabric of society. Yet it was the unexpected intervention, the hand extended in her darkest hour by a complete stranger, the savior who saw her plight and chose to act, that truly redefined her perspective. That single act of benevolence, a beacon of light cutting through the overwhelming darkness, felt like a miracle. It wasn't just about justice being served. It was about the potent, undeniable power of empathy and integrity. The stranger's kindness was a warm, unexpected rain on parched earth, washing away the bitterness and allowing seeds of hope to sprout. It was proof that even in the face of great evil, goodness could not only survive, but triumph. Not always in a loud, dramatic victory, but in quiet, profound moments of connection and courage. This experience, painful as it was, had been a crucible. It had burned away illusions and refined her spirit. She learned that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with fists or shouting, but with quiet determination, the unwavering belief in one's own worth, and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. It was a harsh lesson, etched in scars she would carry, but it came with a profound, undeniable truth, that even when you feel utterly alone, facing the worst of humanity, there is always the possibility of encountering the best of it. Hope, she now understood, was not a naive wish. It was a quiet certainty, found in the actions of those who chose kindness over cruelty, courage over apathy. It was a hope restored, shining brighter against the backdrop of the darkness she had overcome. The world could be a place of great pain, yes, but it was also a place where a single act of compassion could change everything. The echoes of the conflict began to fade, replaced by a sense of profound peace. The weight truly gone now, leaving behind not emptiness, but a quiet resilience and a deep well of gratitude. She stood taller, not just physically, but in spirit. The lessons learned woven into the very fiber of her being. The experience had been a harsh teacher, but its final lesson was one of enduring hope. Hope found not in the absence of darkness, but in the unwavering presence of light, often carried by the most unexpected hands. It was a reminder that even one act of kindness, one moment of courage, could tip the scales, proving that humanity, despite its flaws, held within it the capacity for immense good. And in that understanding, she found not just healing, but a quiet, powerful sense of peace that settled over her like a warm, protective cloak. The path ahead was clearer now, illuminated by the light of lessons hard-earned and hope beautifully restored.